So we've been hearing a lot throughout the day about that more sustainable green agenda. I know that's something zero carbon is very close to Bruntwood's heart. So Jessica, can you talk a little bit about the work that you're doing and how that connects as a property developer, how that impacts on the transport conversation we've been having today?
Yeah. Well, I think we need to see ourselves as placemakers and a critical part of making cities brilliant places to be, and our businesses will only succeed if the cities we're in succeed. And I think from our perspective, seeing a really easy, livable city where people can move around it really straightforwardly and in ways that they want to and like and is good for their well-being is a really important part of what we see as the bigger picture for the cities that we work in. And so part of that is the green agenda, and sustainable transport, really important part of that. And I sit on Chris Boardman's panel for making allocations of funding towards cycling and walking, and we see that as a really important thing for the city region. And I think it's been really brave for Greater Manchester to put so much money behind improvements to cycling and walking in the city. But it's really, for us, it comes back to creating really livable spaces, because that attracts talent to the city. It makes it a good place for the best people in the world to be attracted to, and is part of what's going to make the city successful economically in the long term.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. So Mike, Muse seem to love sites that involve partnering with Network Rail, not necessarily the easiest joint venture partner. Why do you like them so much?
Well, I think we're seeing a definite shift, and I think we're all aware of this, to businesses and people in general wanting to live and experience cities. And developers will go where the demand is. That's the fundamental. So if you've got the occupiers, whether they're businesses, firms, companies, or whether they're people who want to live in the city, that's ultimately where we're going to target. And increasingly, businesses want to locate themselves in or around transport hubs, public transport hubs, because you'll find that one of the key determining factors as to where a business may wish to locate is not necessarily the building itself or the rent that they're going to be paying for that building. It will be their ability to resource staff. And having a talent pool on your doorstep, or having the ability for that talent pool to come to your business, to come to your location, is very much directly relevant to how close you are to these public transport hubs. So we find that businesses are targeting these areas, hence developers will follow that demand. So as you say, invariably that means we're dealing with Network Rail or other transport companies or train operating companies or whatever. And sometimes you have to recognise that these companies, property isn't their foremost priority. They are transport companies. Mm-hmm. So you do have to have a little bit of patience when you're dealing with them. You just have to recognise that's the case. But as Chris Grayling was just saying, these things don't happen overnight. There's no quick fix. That's true in our game as well. Urban regeneration and regenerating cities and our towns is not an overnight game. So unfortunately we do I think there are ways we could speed it up, but it is a long-term game.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I think that leads quite nicely, Julian, to something you were saying to me when we spoke on the phone before this event about transport providers, that they're urban regenerators first and then transport providers second, but that's lost. I mean, how do you think that regeneration impact can really be brought to the fore?
Yeah, I mean, what I was talking about there was I seem to have spent the last time I've been working in Manchester now for 10 years, and I seem to have spent all of those 10 years saying to the transport providers exactly what you've just paraphrased there, that this is about urban regeneration. It is not just about delivery of train services. And one of the things that we've been doing for the City Council and TfGM is to provide a vision around Piccadilly Station, which is not just about the growth bounce when HS2 and NPR arrive, but it's also about saying to HS2 and to NPR and to others that you need to think about the station as an integrated whole. It needs to be a single entity so that we can plug, national high speed into local, regional rail services. And so, that is the agenda. It's not just about playing with trains. It is about regenerating cities and putting the right infrastructure in the right place and, connecting those facilities to the city centre in the right way. So that's been our agenda, and that's what we're trying to do. 10 years in, we're still having those conversations. We're still talking to HS2. I think one of the interesting things about the way in which the City Council and TFGM have tackled Piccadilly is to, rather than sit and receive whatever it is that DFT and HS2 and central government come up with, the City and TFGM have got on the front foot and said, we are Manchester, this is what Manchester wants. Manchester is a world city, we want a world-class infrastructure hub at the heart of it. How are you going to help us deliver that? Because if you think you're going to come to Manchester and park a tin box in the city centre, that ain't going to happen, okay? And so that kind of proactive attitude is a really kind of, it's certainly fresh in my experience of city councils getting on the front foot and putting out some there which admittedly challenges the audience that we're speaking to, but I would wager that it's actually advanced the discussion much further than we might otherwise have got rather than the mode of just sitting back and receiving.
Thank you. So, Adam, for those who don't know, update on what's going on at Mayfield, but also that site is very close to Piccadilly. So how is your plan for the future, bringing in some of the work that Julian's doing?
Yeah, sure. So obviously Mayfield, a great example of public and private sector working together. Great, strong progress, phase 1 application going in and currently out for consultation. I think it's an example where there is control over a large asset alongside rail infrastructure. And it's given really the partnership the flexibility to do interesting things in terms of retaining assets and reusing those in terms of the depot, investing in a public realm and green infrastructure in the early phases to help create that place, and yet also thinking definitely about how we link into Piccadilly, that passenger and pedestrian experience, really key. Taxes, all those issues need to be thought about. Are at the forefront of what we're thinking. Mm-hmm.
Is there challenges in terms of bringing development alongside the transport timelines? I know we had James Heather from your joint venture partner, you and I, a year ago, talking about platform 15 and 16 at Piccadilly. That's still not happening. So how do you deal with those kind of frustrations?
Yeah, I mean, it's working in the rail environment, and there are challenges and constraints and opportunities, really. I think it's that early engagement or active engagement with the rail community, working with them rather than against them. I think that's what we're doing to try and look at alternative solutions that are within our control. And wider outside Mayfield, throughout GM really, we're starting to look at where those opportunities are, where we can take that sort of early engagement to prepare for when these great infrastructure projects come in, that the land and property environment is right, really.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. So, Neil, before we kind of talk about the transport impact on property, I just wanted to pick up on freight, because I think there's a lot of talk around kind of passengers moving on the transport network today and not so much about freight, and I know that's something that Peel talks a lot as owner of both ports and airports. So I don't know if you want to make a case for remembering freight.
I like that phrase, remembering freight. I mean, I think transport is, we've got to remember that we're an island. We're surrounded by water and air. Our international connectivity is driven by airports and ports. Our supply chains these days are driven by transport, and it's hugely important that we do get that connectivity right to ports such as the Port of Liverpool, Hull, airports such as Manchester, but also Liverpool and Doncaster Sheffield Airport, and we make sure that those transport connections are up to speed. We've got projects that ultimately could add to the connectivity around the Port of Liverpool that Highways England are pursuing, that will allow greater connectivity to the motorway network. But in addition to that, the railway network is a huge issue for us. In terms of transporting goods across the north, and we know how important people view passenger freight, and HS2 has been mentioned today, but transporting goods across the north takes hours. If you're trying to get goods from the Port of Liverpool to somewhere in Yorkshire, it will take you a huge amount of time. Indeed, the way the railway network works is actually you've got to travel south before you can go north. So transporting goods is essential for us.
Mm-hmm. And you've got a big ambition, obviously, to grow, Port of Liverpool, Liverpool 2, up to capacity. Could that issue of transferring freight restrain that ambition?
I think transporting freight goes beyond just the Port of Liverpool. There are other opportunities. The Manchester Ship Canal is just 125 years old and is only 7% utilised. There's still opportunity to use what the Victorians created for us 125 years ago and create a regional port that would allow the Port of Liverpool to be the front end to the Atlantic. And that's our aspiration, ultimately, ports of Warrington, of Manchester, Salford, connecting to the Port of Liverpool.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you. So Mike, you talked about the desire for many companies and people to be located near rail hubs, but in a lot of locations, especially across the north, these schemes are still quite slow to really get moving. Why do you think that is?
Well, I think Chris Grayling sort of outlined some of the issues and challenges. There seems that any major transport scheme has got so many issues it has to deal with and get everything aligned before it can go ahead, not least the funding. You have to accept that there isn't a great deal of funding around, there isn't enough around in central government that we need, and it's competing with budgets for housing, social care, NHS and everything else. So that doesn't help because we want more money into transport. Of course we do. There's land ownership issues, there's planning issues. One of the things for me that I think we really got to try and wrestle with and see if we can sort of almost not unlock the system but make it a little bit more streamlined and make things happen quicker is really the planning process. You have planning, you have compulsory purchase orders, you have consultation, you have call-ins. All these things can lead to things not happening rather than things happening. And I think in some ways, my view is we probably consult a bit too much in this country and we should get on with it. We look at things like, I'm not an expert in this field, but Heathrow third runway, how long have we been talking about that? We either should can it or do it, And I just think sometimes if you're going out to consultation, you're trying to get all stakeholders and all views, that's all very well, but you'll never ever please everybody with these projects. And at best you'll end up with a compromise, at worst it'll never happen. So we need to try and find a way of getting through that sort of very, very lengthy planning process and give schemes approval much earlier.
I'm going to give you an early warning of my developer says we consult too much headline. Only kidding, Mike. So Jessica, Bruntwood, I know you do a lot with assets near stations, particularly one coming forward over in Leeds. If you could talk a bit about the platform.
Yeah, so I was musing on, excuse the pun,
Very good.
on your kind of working with Network Rail, and we similarly really like locations that are right near transport hubs because you can see the value of that in terms of people being able to access them and move around and see the sort of the benefits of being so closely located to hubs. So we have a building just on the railway at Leeds Station called Platform, which was for many people who worked in the public sector in Leeds, they will have worked in that building while it was City House, and it was sort of pretty much derelict for many people working in there. But it took a long time to bring that forward, and there are so many complications with working with Network Rail over a live railway. And so, these are things that are worthwhile doing because they give so much back to the city and are so attractive for occupiers and customers that it's worth not just demolishing that and letting that building go, but to bring it back to life. So, we're really keen on that. But I think the reason why this connectivity, and we've been talking about sort of Northern Powerhouse, is so important is that point about access to talent and people being able to access these centres more quickly and being able to really work off that talent pool.
Thank you. So, Adam, aside from Mayfield, you've also been doing work with Transport for Greater Manchester on the Rail Station Alliance. If you could give a bit of an update on that.
Yeah, so it's a collaboration, and it's really around one voice for that rail community to engage, to do a number of things really. It's regeneration and development, accessibility and the customer experience, and also, again, it's some of the early thinking from TFGM about bringing community users into those great spaces that can be created around stations. I think it's been a really interesting exercise looking at all of the 96, identifying where potentially the opportunities are, where the priorities are, and you're facing similar constraints and similar opportunities in each. So the interesting thing is look at them on a scalable basis and to start looking at combining sites and portfolios, and there are lots of opportunities there. But I think the powerful thing we hope will be, again, that sort of one voice for the market to engage with, and for us to create really investable opportunities around these stations. So very exciting.
Do you think you've seen too much of a focus on kind of city centre transport hubs? So that's why the stations out in the boroughs have been left behind.
Well, I think that's definitely the next wave of opportunities. Looking at affordability in some of these locations, and it's not a copy and paste in terms of some of the major stations, but you're looking at, again, I say community users, looking at co-working, reuse of some of those buildings, and again, common challenges around car parking, consolidating that, looking at affordable housing. So I think that's going to be a very interesting wave, and again, it's around GM towns, but also suburban locations. Can they be sort of mini urban villages that really deliver sort of jobs, homes, investment, and improvements to the station as well?
Thank you. So, Neil, Media City UK is probably a good example of somewhere where relatively blank canvas and transport really enabled that development. What needed to come in line in order to enable that to happen?
I mean, just listening to what colleagues are saying, it does sound as if collaboration is one of the key factors here. And Media City, as you say, was a complete brownfield site. Historically, it was a derelict port, and there are something like 28,500 people living and working in Salford Quays at the moment. What really enabled Media City to become a hub for transport purposes is the Metrolink, and the collaborative nature of that was that Salford City Council took the lead to actually underwrite that route when Media City was being built. So it was extremely important that connectivity was there, and it was supported in a collaborative way by Salford Council.
Thank you. And so, Julian, in terms of other projects you worked on Crossrail for a number of years. What have you learnt from that in terms of the projects you're now doing up in the north?
Well, I'll answer that in just a moment, Jess, but I feel I should probably fess up to something. I think I'm the token southerner on the panel. I've been travelling to Manchester, as I say, for 10 years, travelling on Virgin trains, train every 20 minutes, and for a long time thinking, what's the big problem with public transport in the east, in the north? Don't get it. 2 years ago, my parents moved from a life in the south to be looked after by my sister, who lives in Sheffield, and so I now travel regularly trans-Pennine. I get it. I get the problem big time. I mean, the service on that line is absolutely outrageous. The trains are too short, they're always packed, and I completely get it. And, also as an employer of half a dozen in a studio in Manchester, the disruption that people suffered, last year, was outrageous and would not be tolerated in the south of England. And, so I am firmly behind the levels of investment which the Secretary of State said are going into the north. I would also suggest they should probably be double what they currently are to make sure that the backlog is well and truly dealt with. So having got that off my chest, in terms of our learnings for Crossrail, so we did schemes up to planning for the 13 surface stations on Crossrail, where you emerge from the tunnel portal to the west of Paddington through to Reading. huge impact. Probably the biggest change in the boroughs that those, the various points along the line that was called out. And I think probably the biggest learning there was, again, this sort of slightly narrow-minded attitude of the transport providers. I won't personalise them, but the transport providers involved in that discussion, in that our remit was limited to the red line boundary of their ownership. And we're saying you can't have the biggest change and the biggest investment in this community and just look at that for that to be your lens of study. It's got to be much wider. So I have to say, even though we had no remit to do it, we just couldn't help but go beyond the boundary and say, look, we've got to understand how this affects all of these wider issues, and how one creates a sense of place, how one gets into local transport networks, cycling networks, walking routes, yada, 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 yada. Because you cannot land something like that into a local community unless you do that kind of thing. I hope those lessons have been learnt from Crossrail, and I hope they're going to be applied to HS2. Certainly, our work here is a bloody great big push from the City of Manchester to say these things matter, and we are going to do them collectively. So, hopefully those lessons have been learned.
Thank you. And Neil, so we've heard a lot over the course of the day about the Green Book, how transport projects are kind of judged as worthy of investment, and you've done a little bit of work into that. So what are your thoughts on this?
Indeed, we've been working with the Metro Mayors, but just coming back to what Julian was saying, is my next journey is on the so-called Trans-Pennine Express to Sheffield, so I'll be able to give you a call and tell you how my experience was.
You won't, because you won't get a signal.
You absolutely won't get a signal. That's for sure.
I won't get a seat and I won't get a signal. The work that we've been doing is we sponsored a report by a company called Metro Dynamics, and they were looking at the methodology, the assessment associated with investment. So the work that IPPR have done, and which Chris Grayling referred to, about the spend per head, only gives a part of the picture. It talks about the amount of investment, but it doesn't actually tell you what the symptom is. And we believe the symptom is down to the way in which investment decisions are made, and that assessment is the Green Book, and that the value for money drivers associated with the Green Book is driving investment decisions in infrastructure to areas that are already successful, and those areas are in London and the South East, and therefore it becomes self-defeating unless you change either the Green Book or you put in place a shared prosperity agenda, which is about what the National Infrastructure Commission were targeting, which is infrastructure across investment across the whole of the UK. So we feel that the Green Book is the symptom, and that they need to find a way to tweak that Green Book to not focus solely on the economic outputs.
Thank you. Jessica?
Yeah, given we're sharing dirty secrets from the stage, I spent 15 years working in the Department for Transport at the beginning of my career, and I absolutely agree with that point about the Green Book appraisal and how we appraise transport projects just being fundamentally flawed. What it doesn't take account of is the transformational impact of investment in transport infrastructure, and in particular in those big pieces of infrastructure that you can see across the country. If you think about your own experience of as roads were developed, canals, railways, and then high-speed trains, actually these, and links like Crossrail, but also links out to Canary Wharf, when the Jubilee line was put in, these are absolutely transformational, and on a Green Book appraisal they don't work because they don't take account of the fact that there will be new activity created and new journeys developed and fundamental changes in the way that land use works. So I completely agree with that, and it's a massive challenge.
Thank you. Can I get Slido on the screen, please? Manchester desperately needs a tunnelled metro. How can we get this at the same time as HS2, HS3? Julian.
I think that there are enough discussions about what it is that's currently on the table, but those discussions shouldn't just stop when hopefully HS2 and NPR are delivered, these kind of discussions must continue, and they must, it's not like all of that investment goes in and then that's it, job done. The investment has got to continue because growth will continue. I mean, one of the things, it's not quite Metro, well, it's not Metro, but Metrolink. One of the big decisions, one of the big moves at the heart of the work we're doing at Piccadilly is to move Metrolink from where it currently is. So it's heavily constrained in that sort of belly of the listed station. It just simply does not have the room to expand and to develop the capacity that it will need to serve all of the people passing through the station. So the big strategic move is to shift that to the north of the station and put it directly underneath HS2. So there's obviously that thing I was saying earlier about connecting high-speed national to local, regional, direct connection. And it's also, so there is a huge commitment to that. It causes all manner of challenges that have to be resolved, but the city and the TfGM firmly put their foot down and said this is fundamental to getting the station to work, but also to get the city to work more effectively, and have kept that foot firmly applied to the floor, and that is now being baked into the thinking about the way in which the station will evolve. So there's a good example of being absolutely clear in your strategy. So perhaps once we've done all of this, the next part of the conversation can be sort of other means of getting through the centre of Manchester.
Thank you. Thoughts, I think, Neil, is there a fair way for the public sector to capture a proportion of the uplift in land values that transport investment drives? If so, what?
Is there a fair way? Well, some of us are developers sat here, and there should be absolutely developer contributions supporting the infrastructure, particularly transport, for the projects that we're undertaking. I think the question of fairness is an important one, and at what point does the level of developer contributions actually detract from investment? And I think government and policymakers have got to make their own mind up about the levels of contributions, because we're probably already, we heard Chris Grayling talk about agricultural land going from whatever to whatever. We're already to the point where somewhere like 40 to 45% of developer contributions are going through in terms of support for Section 106 and SIL and so forth. So it's important to get the balance right to bring forward investment. There's a lot of talk about land value capture. I think we need to be really careful to make sure that it doesn't detract from investment.
Thank you. And Jessica, your views on this, having gone national government, local government, private sector?
Of course, there must be a fair way of doing this, but I think the point is that those contributions need to all be seen in the round, along with the value of what's being created into the wider economy from the development that you're unlocking. And we've seen, I think from our perspective, the only way you do successful business is to act fairly for the places that you're in, and that is about creating sustainable cities, wanting to continue to do work there. There's no point being, a fly investor and heading off into the sunset. So that is about paying your way and making that fair contribution. But those come in a whole range of ways, not just about land value uplifts, but also around the taxation you pay, the way that you employ people, the local employment that you generate, and the way that you support the communities that you're part of.
Thank you. So Adam, your thoughts on this, and then Mike. So are developers reliant on the public sector to put its hand in its pocket to make plots near railway stations deliverable, as many are tricky brownfield sites?
Well, I think yes, that is happening. You see a number of examples of local authorities throughout Greater Manchester North West taking that proactive role. And again, note the caution around land value capture. These are all challenging locations around rail environments, brownfield land, contamination, planning. So the public sector, it has changed. It is evolving. It is taking on risk and investing in those areas. And it's doing so in some instances because the market's not there. It has to help create the market and create that value. And yes, if it does, then capture a fair share of that. Yeah.
Thank you. Mike?
Yes, I'd agree with that. We are often reliant on the public sector helping out on some of these brownfield sites because of the challenges that come with them, particularly around railway stations. There's always fibre to move. Often the land is contaminated because of past use if it's surrounding a station. We're dealing with one at the minute that's got an 8-metre wide culvert running through underneath. There's one we're also involved with where we've got a BT shaft 30 metres down, an access chamber we've got to build over. And all these are constraints and challenges we, as a developer, we've got to sort of cost into the scheme and overcome. And a pure appraisal of the opportunity often shows that it's unviable. So we are looking for grant or loan at least to try and help us get over that viability trigger and enable these sites to happen. And there are funding pots around, HIF, LEP money, Transformational Cities Fund's been mentioned today. It's preferable if it's grant rather than loan, but a lot of the time we're prepared to do our appraisals and our work on an open book basis so that we can show that at the end of the development, if it has made a lot of money, then we are prepared to, paying that money back or contribute to the to the public sector for other transport initiatives or whatever it may be. I think that sort of collaborative partnership, open book approach is the key to sort of getting money back into the public purse out of private development.
Thank you. And I think your views, interesting to get the views of people really working on the ground. We've heard a lot today about HS2. Is it happening? Isn't it happening? I mean, Neil, your views on HS2, would it be a big deal if it got cancelled?
I think we'd say that we're passionate about the north, and our focus has always been the north connectivity, connecting those dots up across the north. Chris forgot to mention Sheffield when he was talking earlier on. So connecting the cities and towns across the north, Northern Powerhouse Rail is the project that we think is the priority and would always think is the priority.
Thank you. Jessica, your views on that?
These are part of a network, and actually I think we get pushed into a discussion about should this be one or the other, and we need to see this as a network, and actually the connections between Sheffield and Leeds and Sheffield and Manchester are all are not simply a Northern Powerhouse Rail question, but are part of that wider network. And I think the most important thing around HS2 and Northern Powerhouse Rail is being able to create an investment plan that goes beyond one parliament. And I know that's really challenging for government, but without that kind of certainty and without that long-term view that goes beyond the next 5 years, we will never get any of this delivered. And I'm delighted at the work that Transport for the North has managed to do, but it is that next phase of, okay, so now let's get the money and the funding plan and the investment that's certain behind it. And I think from a developer's perspective, certainty is one of those things that the public sector can give you, which will help you, which is one of the things as well as money that is part of what helps you unlock development and potential.
Thank you. Would anyone like to ask a question into a microphone? That's fine. You can store your questions up for our 2 mayors that we'll have joining us shortly. So final question from me then for all of the panellists, starting from Adam. So if you could see one transport change, one transport initiative actually be implemented, what would it be?
Again, I go back to my day job and things we're working on. Obviously, these infrastructure projects will happen and will be fantastic and have transformational benefits, but it's about working with local partners, again, from our perspective, from a land and property view, to make sure there's the right environment that when they do arrive, you can maximise the benefits. And it's part of our work with local authorities, Network Rail, TFGM, and yes, stuff we're keen to support.
Thank you. Julian?
I mean, I agree with the comment about, you shouldn't really talk about HS2 and NPR as being different things. They are one integrated thing. But, if one had to choose, I would say that NPR is far more important, in terms of, getting the cities of the north connected as this kind of idea of this super conurbation to make that a reality. I think that would be, and I thought the comment from, was it the Lords Select Committee this morning about, concerns about the costs of HS2 and that, rather than delaying the link, the stage up to the north, actually maybe have a look at the whole thing and maybe spend a little bit less on the bit in the south to make sure the bit in the north really happens. I thought that was kind of a debate that needs to be had.
Thank you. Neil?
I think we all agree on one thing, that transport needs to be planned over the long term rather than single parliaments. I think that is a hugely important point. Just thinking about the sort of policy side of things, I guess decarbonisation of the transport system would be the biggest potential innovation that we could look forward to over the coming years. Liverpool City Region is starting to use hydrogen buses. We've got businesses that are looking at the production of hydrogen on a more local basis. HGVs would benefit from having hydrogen fuel cells associated with them from a fueling basis and a long-term travel basis. So thinking about alternative sources of fuel for our transport network, I think, is probably what we would be thinking about.
Thank you. Mike?
Well, being a northerner 3 or 4 years ago, I was asked about the HS2 and the priorities, and I argued that we should be starting it in the north rather than the south. And I still think that's the biggest thing we should be looking for. I would stop spending the money on the London to Birmingham, and I'd pool those funds into connecting the cities in the north and create a proper alternative to London up here.
Well, the Economic Scrutiny Committee agreed with you, so. Yeah. And Jessica finishes off.
Well, mine's a very personal one. I would love to have driverless electric vehicles as of tomorrow, and I really hate driving, and that would be a personal, massive benefit to my life.
Fabulous, thank you. Please join me in thanking our panel.